Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, we sit down with the president of the Illinois Trial Lawyers Association, John Scanlon. We discuss with Mr. Scanlon several issues related to the work of the state's trial lawyers and ask him if Illinois' workers' compensation is too high and driving businesses from the state. We also ask him about the prevalence of trial lawyers bringing frivolous lawsuits against companies, and we ask about the perception that trial lawyers cooperate exclusively with Democrat politicians. Following that, in 45 minutes, from the Illinois Association of School Boards annual conference, we sit down with 4 state education leaders and talk about issues affecting Illinois education. We'll hear from Roger Eddy, the executive director of the Illinois Association of School Boards, and Brent Clark, the executive director of the Illinois Association of School Administrators, among others, as they talk about the process of implementing the new school funding formula, the effects of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and the increasing need for new safety measures in schools. And finally, in 1 hour and 30 minutes, we talk to Jonathan Edison, a success strategist and author of Survival Mode, the true story of a young man's triumphant journey through loss, poor grades, failures, setbacks, depression, and homelessness. Mr. Edison discusses his memoir, how he overcame a rough childhood to make it to Harvard University, and how he passes on his life lessons to students throughout the country. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members.
Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. Since 1985, we've worked to educate the public and those who serve as trustees and pension boards about issues that impact the financial health of publicly funded pensions. Our members manage over $18 billion in pension assets. That's a huge number. But we never forget those dollars belong to the men and women who've worked as firefighters, police officers, and as educators. We want them to know that their pension dollars are safely invested. They also want to know that someone will keep an eye on legislation that could threaten their pension. And that's why the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association is fighting against laws that would reduce the pensions earned by our members. And this is why we support the work of the Illinois Channel. Their unbiased, in-depth coverage of the pension reform issue allows us and our members to hear arguments on both sides of the pension issue, to follow legislation as it moves through committee, or to hear unedited interviews with key lawmakers as they discuss what changes are being considered. Pensions are very important. They're also very complex. Pension reform can't adequately be covered in sound bites. But the Illinois Channel provides a connection to the Capitol, the governor, and lawmakers that we all need to stay on top of key issues. Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. I watch the Illinois Channel, and I hope you do too.
Next, from Chicago, we sit down with the president of the Illinois Trial Lawyers Association, John Scanlon. We discuss with Mr. Scanlon several issues related to the work of the state's trial lawyers and ask him if Illinois' workers' compensation is too high and driving businesses from the state. We also ask him about the prevalence of trial lawyers bringing frivolous lawsuits against companies, and we ask about the perception that trial lawyers cooperate exclusively with Democrat politicians. This runs about 45 minutes.
John Scanlon, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Good afternoon, Terry.
As the head of the trial lawyers, often the trial lawyers, I should say, are in the news and many times the whipping boy, so to speak, of whatever politicians want to blame you for some of the things going on. And it seems like over the last decade or so, especially the trial lawyers have been made responsible by some for a number of things. We talked off camera about going back to about 2004. The big one was medical malpractice. They did pass a bill which was then ultimately ruled unconstitutional. Now the issue is often medical or not workers' compensation insurance. And so we wanted to get your side of it because we hear so many times that the trial lawyers are the reason why businesses are fleeing Illinois, among other reasons. On that topic, as a broad opening statement, I presume you would disagree with that. Why would you say that the workers' compensation in Illinois is not too high?
Before I reach at it, I just want to say, just in a more general sense, I've lived here my whole life. I grew up in Chicago, South Side. I now live just west of the city in Downers Grove. I'm married. I have 5 kids. I love the state. I love our city of Chicago. And I care deeply about it. So my interests are not just limited to my current role as president of the Illinois Trial Lawyers or my occupation as a partner at the Scanlon law firm. I really do care about our state. And my family, both sides, have been here since they came to this country. So any thought that anything in the long run would be harmful to this state, I would be against. On the other side of that, I grew up in a family where, because of their status coming to this country, oftentimes they had to take jobs that were more dangerous and difficult. And fortunately, during their lifetimes, protections were enacted for them. And we still have those today, but they're under constant attack. You brought up the topic of workers' compensation, and before I get to that, Terry, I just want to highlight how things have changed during my lifetime. I always expected our leaders in this state, in this city, to do whatever they could to make it a better place and encourage investment here. That's no longer the case. I saw something last month that I've never seen before. A governor, through his campaign, had 3 governors from adjoining states mocking us. And just think about that for a minute. I take my position as the head of this organization very seriously. I want in the worst way to make sure that when my term ends, I hand it off to somebody in the same shape or better as when I received it. That doesn't appear to be the case with our current leadership. When you ask 3 governors to go on our airwaves to mock our state, how is that going to help us in any way? It's not. Illinois is a great state, and we have a lot to be proud of. I don't know if people realize this, and I want to get this out here before we start talking about the business climate or workers' compensation. We have the 5th largest economy compared to all other 50 states. We're number 5 in the country for gross domestic product. Have you heard anybody say that in the last 5 years?
Not often.
Right. What do you hear? Everything's bad here. Well, we're still number 5 in the country. Our great detractors or mockers from Wisconsin, Indiana, or Missouri, the 3 governors of those states, when they came on the air, they don't talk about that. The reason they don't is they can't come close to our status there. They're 16, 20, and 22, respectively. Now, there's a reason we're the 5th largest economy in the country. Our businesses, our universities, our hospitals, our airports. It is still a great state and a great place to be. And this idea that somehow workers' compensation is keeping, the rates of workers' compensation is keeping employers from here, nonsense. On the list of concerns for corporate CEOs, workers' compensation insurance ranks below 60. And here specifically...
And where does that come from?
That comes from National Business Week. It's a publication. More importantly, if you look at our state individually, there may be certain states in this country where there are some problems with the workers' compensation system. And in fact, in our state, there were some legitimate concerns raised earlier, 10 years ago. And so, the legislature, democratically controlled, enacted some reforms in 2011. You're probably aware of those, right? Since 2011, I don't know if people realize this, but since 2011, 19% drop in claims payouts. That means workers' compensation companies are paying out 19% less in payouts for injured workers than they were back in 2011.
Are you talking about the insurance companies?
Yes.
Okay.
And I know what your question is going to be in a minute, and I'm going to get there. So the insurance companies pay out 19% less since the reforms of 2011. Their profits have gone up 22%. Again, we're talking about the insurance companies that write workers' compensation policies. Finally, filings are down, meaning new claims filed by injured employees are down 15%. So you have 15% less claims, 19% less in costs, and 22% increase in profits. That's from NCCI. That's an insurance industry analyst. They're not allied with anyone. They just do analysis for the industry. I'm sure you're wondering then, if you have a 22% profit increase, a 19% cost decrease, 15% decreasing in premiums, I'm sure you're wondering how much of that was passed on to the employers of our citizens. None. Last year, premiums went up 3.9%. It's incredible to think that all this additional money is being made after the reform measures, and none of it is being put back to the employers. That was the whole point of the reform legislation. Let's find a way to make it easier on our employers. Let's drive down their costs, and we can do that by making it more difficult for an injured worker to file a claim or win a claim. It was done. There is more money in the system now. It has not gone back to the employers. So we're now in a climate where for the last 2 years we've heard nothing but we need more workers' compensation reform. And the only thing I can say to that is, you're right if you're talking about reform on the insurance carriers themselves. Some type of system to ensure that when these kinds of profits are being made, some of that money filters back to employers. Anyone who would suggest that further reforms need to be made that would restrict the right of workers are wrong. 15% decline in filings tells you those reforms have drastically reduced the amount of claims filed.
Let's, Greg Bay's the head of the Illinois Manufacturers Association. I don't remember the specific numbers, but he had a press conference, and in fact I interviewed him, and we were in the at a manufacturer talking with the business owner as well as Mr. Bay's. And Greg was saying the cost, let's say, of a broken arm in Illinois is something like 2 or 3 times as much as in Indiana. So might it be, maybe there's someone to blame for these costs being high. Maybe it's not the trial lawyers. Have the trial lawyers as an industry, and I know you've got businesses to run independently, it's not like you have nothing else to do. Could the blame be laid that the hospitals in Illinois, the care providers who have been so cut back on Medicaid compensation, that they're cost shifting and putting more and more of their billing to cover their operating cost onto the cost of treating workers' comp, because there is that insurance, and sometimes maybe the people who are insured coming in, maybe their insurance is nowhere near as good as the workers' compensation insurance.
So
I don't know if that's true. I'm just posing that as an issue.
It's an interesting question, and one that I've thought about. Let me first tell you, part of the 2011 reforms were a rate schedule for medical providers to reduce the amounts paid to them. And you know, frankly, the hospitals, doctors were upset about it, but they accepted it. It did cut back on the amount that they could earn. Cost of medical care in this country is high. So certainly some of the costs that you're talking about can be attributable to medical costs. But to say that that's the bulk of the reason why awards here might be higher than Indiana probably isn't capturing the whole story. You may know this, you may not. But in a workers' compensation case...
Can I insert for the viewers here? I believe Indiana is probably the least costliest workers' comp. Is that right, in the nation?
I don't, honestly, I can't speak to where they rank in the nation.
Illinois is where, about 7 out of 50 states?
It's actually, we are now higher or lower than that. I think we're closer to 10 at this point.
Okay.
I don't have the NCI statistics.
So
for
the
this
point
current.
is, on one hand, when we compare ourselves to neighboring Indiana, it's an extreme comparison because Indiana's last in the nation as far as maybe their compensation costs. If we were to compare it to other states, the gap wouldn't be as much. On the other hand, Illinois, the business people would say we're still, let's say 10. Why are we still so high? They might say if the 2011 reforms did what you said, and maybe the point is you answered that. Maybe you would say because the cost savings haven't been passed along by the insurance carriers.
Clearly haven't. Clearly haven't. The NCCI insurance body has recommended for the last 4 years that premiums go down. Cumulatively, in that period of time, if you add up all those recommendations, we're at about a 36% recommendation for a decline. None of that's happened. This last year, just came out a month ago, they recommended that the premiums go down over 10%. They just aren't doing it. Can we go back for a minute, though,
Sure.
to this distinction between Illinois and Indiana? Okay. Part of the reason our comp awards are higher here is workers' compensation awards are based generally on two things: how severe the injury is and what rate of pay a person is making. I don't know that that's the fairest way of doing things, but that's the way it's done across the country. So the same worker who's making $10 an hour, or a worker making $10 an hour who has the same injury as somebody who makes good wages, say $25 or $30 an hour at a union job, is going to have an award that's roughly a third of that, okay? I'm giving that example because to compare...
Is it basically to compensate the person for the lost income.
Exactly. It's the severity of the injury and the loss of income. And so your rate of pay factors in a large way to overall awards. So Illinois' awards are going to be higher than states that don't have union protections. Illinois awards are going to be higher than a state that don't pay workers well, where workers have to work 3 part-time jobs just to pay their mortgage. Do we want, I guess the fundamental question is this: do we want to reverse to the state, to a state where we have no longer good-paying blue-collar jobs? Do we want a state where people have to work 2 or 3 jobs? I sure don't. I mean, I was the benefit of family members who worked in Local 399, the building engineers. My mother was a Chicago public school teacher. They were able to work 1 job, support a family. Not amass any great wealth, but support a family the way you would expect from working a good, decent job. I don't want to go backwards. And if we did tomorrow say, we're going to adopt Indiana's policies, what's next? Because I don't know if you watched, but Indiana is losing jobs to Mexico. You understand? Carrier, they lost jobs. The Carrier took jobs and put them in Mexico. So if we do match Indiana, then what's next? Do we have to match Mexico or Bangladesh? How far back do we have to go? And do we go all the way back to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle? Is that when businesses will be satisfied? We have to think about our whole society here. A bigger point that doesn't get raised is, what is happening to those people in Indiana if their comp system is more business friendly when they get injured? Who ends up paying their bills? Terry, I'll tell you who typically ends up paying those bills: taxpayers. Because if you can not get a fair comp award and you can no longer work, you're going to go on public aid and Medicaid. Same thing will happen here in this state. If the workers' compensation insurance carriers don't pay for these awards, if somehow these claims are pushed out of the system, made more difficult, and these people can't go back to work, their medical bills will be paid by Medicaid. They'll be receiving money maybe from Social Security. It'll be a public aid problem rather than a workers' compensation problem. I think it's far fairer to impose the cost of the injury on the actual environment where the injury occurred rather than on all taxpayers.
one of the key issues that often gets spoken about in this realm, and I don't necessarily want to spend our entire time just on workers' compensation, but first of all, so if someone's injured on the job, let me back up a little bit and just say how the system works. They go and they apply for workers' compensation.
They do.
It might be something obvious like a broken arm. It could be something more egregious. It could be something like a back that goes out, and the injury, an arm you think is going to typically repair itself and you'll be back to normal within a relatively short amount of time, one would expect. But there could be some other injuries that go on for years where you need to be treated over a 3, 4, 5-year period.
Certainly.
One of the issues with that is therefore then causation. So if your back goes out, was Joe playing softball on Saturday and threw his back out, or was he chopping wood on his farm in Wisconsin, but then he comes to work and says, hey, I threw my back out lifting a box of books. What are your thoughts on the causation? I don't want to get too much into the weeds. We'd spend all our day doing a seminar on this, but on causation, do the employers have a fair argument to say, look, if somebody already had injured their back or had some injury that was pre-existing, or we know that predominantly they threw their back out off work. Now, maybe they lifted a box of books at work, but that was maybe a momentary contributing factor to something that was already injured. They might say, why do we have to pay for the entire cost of care when the person had already injured themselves off work site?
So I can only speak to my experience. I've been doing this over 27 years. The first 10 years of my practice, I personally handled a lot of workers' compensation claims. Now I do all jury trials, but we have several other attorneys here who do handle workers' compensation claims. In my experience, in our cases, and what I've seen of other colleagues' cases, if you're talking about situations where there is an older person who has bad knees or a bad back, there are some people who have those conditions who are office workers who do have activities that are more likely to cause that. Golf, skiing, whatever, right?
Right.
I agree with you, Terry. If that was the case, that's not who I represent. The people I represent are tile setters, sprinkler fitters, and I just want you to think for a minute. Let's take a sprinkler fitter. They put in the sprinklers in the buildings that prevent fires from becoming major disasters. All day long, they're working overhead with their arms overhead, holding up pipes, joining pipes together, working in difficult positions. Now, you may do that as a 20-year-old or even early 30s and have no problems, but do that for 25, 30 years, and by your 40s, you're probably going to have degenerative tears to your rotator cuff. Is that not part of the work environment? Yes, that person may also have.
So let's just. I can hear somebody.
That person may also have other activities. Maybe on a weekend he fishes or golfs. But what do you think is more likely? 40 hours a week putting up overhead pipe, or 40 hours a week kneeling as a tile setter? I mean, arbitrators are experienced. They hear these claims. They know what these people do. And if you're an office worker and you have a back issue, but you also do bodybuilding on the side, they can differentiate between those claims.
Well, and that's the thing. So, I mean, obviously there are going to be legitimate claims.
Yes.
But
and there's going to be claims that get lost.
On that issue of causation, who determines, and should there be some kind of a acknowledgement to say, if this young 30-year-old or 32-year-old was out playing soccer and twisted his knee on the soccer field, should we be applying the cost of his care entirely to his point of work?
Of course not. And that's what arbitrators are for, and those people don't get awards, okay? Can I give you an example from the other side of the spectrum?
And let's back up real quick, because I think people just understand the process here. So there are arbitrators. What do they do?
So think of a judge. In a workers' compensation case, there's no jury. Each side has an attorney. So these companies have very well-trained attorneys that just do workers' compensation defense. And believe me, They get all the medical records, and they look for all the prior problems the person might have had. They find out about all their outside pursuits, and they do their best to blame something other than the work environment for causing an injury. And sometimes that is the case, and an arbitrator will write, we call them a no award. You get nothing, okay? That's what our system's about. It's an adversarial system. Each side gets to litigate and put on their evidence. Not every case is clear-cut, by the way, Terry, okay? Not every case. But let me tell you a flip side story, because no one ever talks about the flip side stories. I was a young attorney. I think I was here not even a year. And we had a call from a widow. Her husband had been shot. He worked at a college as a security guard at 35th Street. Right across the street was Robert Taylor Homes and Stateway Gardens. This campus had security for a lot of reasons, but partly because there was some gang violence in that neighborhood. His building daily would hear gunshots. They put bulletproof glass up in certain areas because some bullets would enter the building. He was shot at work while sitting at a guard station. The shooter wasn't intending to shoot him. He was intending to shoot someone else running in front of him, okay? That university refused the claim. That lady had absolutely no money coming in.
Was the individual killed or?
Dead.
Dead.
Yes. That night, dead on arrival at the hospital. Nothing for the widow. She called us. I thought for sure this would be a case that would, when I say short order, I'm talking about in a year or less, we would get turned around. We just have to litigate it. We did. Arbitrator wrote a no award, meaning we got nothing. I appealed it. The commission agreed. I appealed it to the circuit court. Circuit court agreed.
Agreed with who?
The arbitrator, meaning this
No
was not
award.
a compensable injury. 3 levels all said no. And their logic was this. The shooter wasn't aiming at the guard. Has nothing to do with the work. The guard's very position was to man that front post because they were worried about dangerous people being out front. He was a security guard protecting employees and students from just these kind of acts. He gets shot in the line of duty, and they say it had no connection with the work. I brought in Chicago police detectives to talk about this being the most dangerous beat in the most dangerous district in the city of Chicago and introduced evidence of that, and still the arbitrator didn't write the award. We took that case all the way up to the Illinois Appellate Court and finally got justice. That was 5 years later. Now, ask yourself, how was that fair to that lady to wait 5 years? Do you know what her overall award was, by the way?
No.
$200,000, okay? A lot of people think it's some huge number in comp cases. It's not. $200,000 for the death of her husband. Another example I just want to give
What
you.
would a lawyer, the firm, get on something like that?
It's a 20% statutory fee.
20%.
20%.
Okay.
Another case I want to tell you about, one of my clients went to Springfield.
I want to hear the other one, but let me just, sometimes I want to underscore something. So on the business side, let's say for a law firm, just so people can follow this, if I come in and say, here's my story, and you might, firms typically would say, I would think, if you think you got a case, bring it in and we'll listen to you. You're going to then, as a business of being in the law, evaluate the merits of taking the case on, right? Because
Absolutely.
you just said you were arguing this for 5 years, had a lot of hours in there.
Oh, yes.
I don't know, for 5 years, maybe you made minimum wage on that one. I don't know what.
It's certainly, go ahead, finish your question,
but
then I'll.
the point is, there isn't, you have to have, as it's not just the law and the law book case. If any firm is going to have to evaluate the merits of the case before you take it, right?
Yes.
That's, I guess, basically the thing I wanted to say. So you're the first
Gatekeeper.
judge, you might say, lawyers as they hear the case, because you're going to say, is this a winnable case, the way
Yes.
you know the law and your own sense of where the practice of law is in Illinois?
You're absolutely right. I consider my first function to, both for the client's sake and for our business's sake, you want to be rational about this. You're not doing a client any good dragging something out where really it's not a, we call them compensable injuries, where you believe it really isn't going to be a compensable injury. You're not going to do them any good. And certainly as a firm, it's not going to do us any good to, it's not just man hours we're putting in. We have to spend a lot of money to take doctors' depositions, to create exhibits, you name it.
Right.
So you have to think practically. However, having said that, like any other business, there are certain cases that I'll call them loss leaders where you know you're going to put in a lot more time, more than what justifies, that the return will justify. But you do it because you know something's wrong and you want a chance to stake something out in the law to change it. And that case, probably one of the cases I'm most proud of. I had far bigger, more difficult jury trial cases, but I still look at that case and it makes me smile thinking about how long it took, but it worked, and how happy that woman was, even though it took 5 years, that finally what was logical was true. Can I just give you one other example there too? We were talking a little bit earlier about wage costs in this state versus in Indiana. I have a young man who was 17 working in a ski hill out west, Kane County. And his job, among other things, was to clean out the excess snow underneath one of these conveyor belt lifts that you stand on. And he'd have to crawl underneath and dig out the snow. And unfortunately for him, his arm got swept up in the belt mechanism, and he lost his arm. And he came down to Springfield to testify to the House during an open session on the workers' compensation system and how it's affected him. And I want to tell you two things about his case. He's had over 20 surgeries on this arm because the nerve endings are problematic. They've had to put skin flaps over them, just a number of different things. On one of those surgeries, and this was a clear case where he was working, doing everything he was supposed to, and his arm got taken off. On one of those surgeries, which was being done to alleviate some excruciating nerve pain, the night before the surgery, the insurance company canceled authorization for it. No valid reason was ever given. They just wanted more time to review things. No change was ever made in their position. They ultimately authorized it, but for 30 days, he went without the surgery. Why? Why was that valid to do that when doctors at Northwestern knew he was in nerve pain? It was the 10th or 11th surgery, and they knew that this flap could prevent more pain, and they just pulled the plug on it. That same young man, his weekly benefits, I think, are $170, $180 a week. That's what he gets from our overpaying comp system. So this idea that somehow people are getting, individual plaintiffs are getting some large windfall. No, that boy, in a heartbeat, would take back his former position, and 180 isn't enough for him to really do anything on. He still lives with his parents. So our system, if any reform is needed, it is in trying to figure out how to get the insurance companies to rebate some of that money to the employers. Okay? That's really what needs to be done here. One other thing, maybe you don't know this. Which state in the country has the most workers' compensation insurers? Illinois. We've gone up 13% in the last 10 years. We now have 322. Why are they here? 22% profits. They're keeping all the money to themselves and not allocating some of that back to employers.
I believe Speaker Madigan wanted some kind of a study done as far as if they need to, I suppose, by law, order a rollback in compensations. Are you familiar with that, and where does that stand?
Yes, there were two different proposals made. There was that, where there would be some kind of oversight on how much is a legitimate profit. That hasn't gotten anywhere. The second piece of legislation, which I was very much in favor of. I was in favor of both, but the second one in particular. There was legislation proposed that would have created a not-for-profit workers' compensation insurance carrier in the state of Illinois. The unions were behind it. The Democratic Party was behind it. It was vetoed by the governor. We would have had a not-for-profit insurance carrier out there competing with these 322 other companies. So we could have gotten fairer insurance premiums for employers. It was vetoed. I believe during the veto session they tried to override it, and they kept missing by one vote. There just weren't enough votes. There weren't enough Democrats, and we couldn't get Republicans to sign on to it. So why wouldn't that be a fair thing? Why wouldn't you allow a startup not-for-profit out there? If you think that it has to always be on the capitalistic model, well, then you would win that battle, right? Why not let that not-for-profit have a try at it? They didn't allow it. It was vetoed. That would have been a great thing, because we could have seen, in fact, what real premiums would be.
Some people will say, and we've both heard this argument in the past too, when going back to what we were saying about taking something that, and the example you gave where you argued for 5 years, sometimes people will say, yeah, but a lot of trial lawyers will get a client to bring up a case and they know that the business will just settle because of the cost of litigation. And so therefore, a lot of these trial lawyers are just bringing these suits, never meaning to go all the way to court. They'll accept a $10,000 payment, and maybe the guy who alleges injury will get $7,000 or some amount, and for a couple hours work, the trial attorney makes several $1,000s. Is that a legitimate argument?
You know, I'll say this. If there is a firm or firms doing that, they won't last long in this business. And the reason I say that is life has pendulums, and I've seen pendulums in my own business. I've been through several, 3 different waves of legislative attempts to restrict tort rights, injured persons' rights. When I first started practicing law, and when I was a law clerk, I think perhaps back then things were maybe easier where you could pretty much take any claim and try and do something with it. That's not the case. At the present time, any firm that is foolish enough to take a case where you don't have a valid basis is going to find yourself spending money on a case that you're not going to get offers from, because so many of these insurance companies now have in-house attorneys. They aren't paying outside law firms. They're watching everything. They have their own metrics and analytics, and they're not just paying money to get out of a case. They would rather grind down these law firms that are foolish enough to take those cases. And the verdicts are bearing it out. I'll give you a stat that people probably aren't familiar with. Medical malpractice cases. In this last year in Cook County, which the Chamber and others always seem to have some criticism of, plaintiffs only win 28% of trials. 72% of medical institutions or doctors win medical malpractice trials. So just in that realm alone, you better be absolutely certain if you take one of those cases that you are right and can prove it, because your odds of winning are very slight and the costs are prohibitively high. So it's not a good business model to do what you're suggesting. Maybe back in the 80s people could get by with it, but you certainly can't after these several waves of tort restrictions. It just doesn't exist anymore.
I was going to say, does anyone keep an accounting so that maybe, I don't know, the court system, they might
Yes.
say, here's Smith and Barnes Law Firm. I'm making the name up. But if we know that basically they're the ones that are always bringing in these alleged problems that they're then settling one after another, and maybe 95% of what they bring they just settle, and we might say they're not, I mean, is there any shaming, is there any regulation within the industry, so to speak, to every industry is going to have bad players, whether they're doctors or journalists or lawyers or whatever. You're going to have some people that debase the system and kind of game it for their own purposes. But within the legal system, whether at the court level or just the association of legal firms, is there anyone even accounting for that or trying to hold them accountable?
There are certain mechanisms that are punitive in nature for somebody who files a frivolous lawsuit. A truly frivolous lawsuit, you're at risk of being sanctioned, whether in state court and federal court. Number 2, we have the Attorney Registry and Disciplinary Commission that sits over, they're part of the Supreme Court, essentially. It's a panel that investigates and prosecutes lawyer misconduct. So if, in fact, there is somebody out there committing fraud who's an attorney, their license is at risk. But I'll go back to what I was saying earlier. The idea that there's some kind of rampant filing of frivolous lawsuits is insane. It's just not practical from a business standpoint because you're not going to get anything on it. There is no insurance company out there that is going to throw money around on what they think are demonstrably false claims. They don't do it. I'm telling you, they don't do it. You will be sorely mistaken if you think that you can build a practice doing that. It's not going to work out for you from a business standpoint, and you may end up losing your license. So, no, far more likely what I see is firms that succeed and have a long history. Our firm started in the early 80s. I've been here from day one. The reason we're here and the reason we continue to do well is we take this very seriously. We look at our cases very carefully, and we only file and try the cases that we believe have merit and that we believe we have at least some possibility of winning.
Before we close out, we've spent so much time talking about workers' compensation, and rightfully so, but I'm curious, I think one thing that the trial bar will take people who otherwise don't necessarily know where else to go in a number of cases when they feel they've been wronged. It might be a medical malpractice case, it might be a workers' comp. Where is the business these days relative to a trial attorney bringing suits on the business model of work? If we win, then we get compensation. If we lose, we're out of all that money. Is it still within the medical community? Is it workers' comp? I mean, not just this firm. I mean, I'm talking about just across the board.
Understand.
Is it fiscal? I mean, I look at the aging of the baby boomers, and a lot of times then we get into problems where people are ripping people off as their mental faculties go downhill. And
sure.
I've just heard privately a number of those instances from friends and family.
So kind of interesting. So you're asking me, just from a business standpoint, where do I see?
Where's the growth?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So a couple things I'll say to you. Some of my biggest cases were product liability cases against, one in particular against a large overseas motorcycle manufacturer, another against a large automaker. And those cases were based on product defects where they made the motorcycles or the minivans unsafe. And one thing I can tell you, I do far less product liability today, and there's a reason why. Although financially it probably doesn't benefit me, I certainly am proud of the fact that looking back to say when I started doing products liability in the mid-90s to now, vehicles, automobiles, are so much safer. You know, we used to get a lot of calls on rollovers, right? You're familiar with the term rollover, when the SUVs would roll over? Mm-hmm. It can still happen, but it's far less likely because the auto manufacturers learned to be very careful about short, tall vehicles. And they also have different systems now that will auto-correct. Seat belts, airbags, glass that doesn't shatter. All those things came about because attorneys believed in cases and pursued manufacturers when they were creating products that were dangerous. After a time, after a number of those suits, manufacturers would respond, and they'd come up with safer features. So perhaps in that specific area, automobiles particularly, things have gotten a lot safer. I feel like in certain areas, though, things have gotten less safe. You know, I'm not so sure the FDA has enough time or willingness to make sure that our prescription drugs are really safe. And a lot of times prescription drugs are tested and promoted or authorized for a specific use, and yet when it gets out into the field, they're being prescribed off-label for things that aren't safe. So there's areas there, particularly with the aging population, there's a lot of drugs that do harm that people aren't ever aware of. They just can't be aware of. You know, it takes a more learned person to explain that to them, and a lot of times doctors don't have the ability, and a lot of times manufacturers don't want you to know how much risk is involved. So
I suppose one could make the argument, and not to make the argument for you or the industry, but I think as a realistic, there's only so many cops on the beat. There's
Yes,
only so many
true.
regulators. There are going to be people, and we see it in recent news. Wells Fargo famously, I mean, had a golden reputation of a
Right.
financial institution, and lo and behold, they're opening up accounts without people's permission. No one would have imagined
I know.
an organization with the sterling reputation that they had of ever doing that, and
Right.
yet they did. And I think, again, this is somewhat making the point as far as people would say, it's not to say we're not supposed to have trial lawyers and not supposed to have some recourse to bring a lawsuit, because there are going to be bad actors that the individual is not going to have the financial wherewithal, the typical middle-class person, to hire an attorney and just bring a suit on their own, paying just an hourly fee if there's not going to be the business model that you employ, I guess, or the field employs, where you take a case that you think there's a good chance of winning it, and that there's going to be some compensation for yourself and the firm. And I don't mean it, you just John Scanlon, but extrapolate that across the trial bar.
Certainly, there's, anytime there's an effort, say, to reduce fees or to cap awards, some of the motivation behind that is to drive people out of this business. And this business, either intended or unintended, does great societal good. Because we are, as private citizens, investigating corporations on behalf of our clients, things get uncovered that would never get uncovered by a governmental body because they don't have the budget, or, in our current climate, because there's been directives, whether it be from Washington or Springfield, to stop looking into environmental problems or safety issues in the workplace. Well, if the government isn't going to do that, the only chance as a society we have is if private individuals will undertake that huge task. And there's risk for us. People just look at cases we win, and we lose too. And we get nothing when we lose. So it's a commitment that not everybody is up for taking. I myself have found it fascinating and very rewarding. On a lot of personal levels rewarding. So we live in a world where so many regulations are being taken down. You can have a position on that, right or wrong, but if you're going to take away regulations on companies, somebody should have the ability then to look into things when they do go wrong, if the government is not going to do it. And that is what we do. We look into things. And sometimes there's nothing there. Other times there is something there that needs to be exposed and talked about.
I've kept you longer than I should, but look, if I can squeeze one more question in here. Since the Illinois Channel covers so much politics, what happens in Springfield? We're going into a political election year. The presumption is that the trial bar operates almost exclusively or cooperates exclusively with Democrats or vice versa. Why is that true? And if it is true, why is that true? To what extent does the bar, the Illinois Trial Lawyers Association, I should say, try to reach out to Republicans? And to the extent that you do, I don't know if you should be doing it more or not, but to the extent that you do reach out, do you fund them? Or is it that you just find that those who are Republicans in the legislature tend not to ever be willing to consider your point of view?
So let me just say, in my years of experience, I am familiar with, both on the national level and local level, certain Republicans that do care more about worker safety or consumer rights. I suppose if you're asking me, is it the Illinois trial lawyers' position to support a political party? No. It is our political position to support whichever legislators are going to do what they can to make sure workplaces are safe for our clients, products are safe for our clients, and practices are safe for the patients. I'm for that, and that's what our organization is for. A safe work environment, a healthy environment, one that we don't have to worry about what we're breathing, safe hospitals, safe roadways. And I don't care what side of the political divide you're on. If you're for that, I'd be for you, and so would our organization. So anybody who's going to do something to improve the safety on our roads, safety of trucks on our roads, that's a good thing. And, I think that's the simplest way of answering that.
All right, well, John Scanlon, we appreciate your time, and good luck to you.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Matt Hart, Executive Director of the Illinois Trucking Association. For over 80 years, we've represented the interests of those who work in the Illinois trucking industry. We work with members of the legislature to pass laws to help make the roads safer, to help keep Illinois trucking competitive, and to help provide ongoing educational opportunities for those in our industry. The technology of trucking is forever changing. So too are the laws regulating the trucking industry. That's why the Illinois Trucking Association is proud to support the work of the Illinois Channel, which keeps citizens around Illinois connected to what's happening in state government and what changes are being discussed that will impact their families, their communities, their future. And the Illinois Channel gives those of us in industry an opportunity to share our thoughts on public policy with our fellow citizens across Illinois. I'm Matt Hart, Executive Director of the Illinois Trucking Association. I'm also proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council on Transportation. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next, from Chicago, from the Illinois Association of School Boards annual conference, we sit down with 4 state education leaders and talk about issues affecting Illinois education. We'll hear from Roger Eddy, the Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Boards, and Brent Clark, the Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Administrators, among others, as they talk about the process of implementing the new school funding formula, the effects of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and the increasing need for new safety measures in schools. This runs about 45 minutes.
Watching online, welcome, and we are in Chicago at the Hyatt for the conference on educational issues, and we're joined by the leadership of all the different associations, the primary education associations. So Jason Leahy with the Illinois Principals Association, Mike Jacoba at the Illinois Association of School Business Officials, Dr. Brent Clark with the Illinois Association of School Administrators, and Roger Eddy with the Illinois Association of School Boards. And this, if you don't know, it could be thought of the management side of education. So Mike's membership would handle I often think, Mike, it's interesting, the amount of dollars that go through schools, people, millions of dollars that go through a school, and you don't think about that. You think, you take your school life as a child and extrapolate that, and you never had to think about the money that it takes to run those schools. So why don't we start with you, just as far as trending issues in education. Obviously, we went all these different years, recent history of the school, and sometimes getting funded, not knowing if you're going to get funded. We just went through the whole school funding formula. I'm sure you all want to kind of give a little thoughts on that. But Mike, since we're talking money issues, why don't we open with you? What does the school funding formula mean to your organization, to the running of schools, and from your perspective, and maybe let's, before we get into that, just where are we now, because we were kind of starving a lot of institutions almost out of life. Where are we now as far as cash flow to the schools?
Well, so some state funding has started to flow. That started to come in September, basically equivalent to what you received last year. So the new funding model has not been actually articulated to the new monies yet. So it's $350 million in that new funding model is not yet coming out to the schools. So we're kind of in a waiting game for that. Some estimates say maybe January, but it could be later. Nobody's quite sure about that. In the meantime, State Board of Education is going through a process where they're verifying enrollment data for the past 3 years with school districts, because this being the foundational year of the new funding formula, everything will be related to this year, because that becomes the base funding for the whole formula. So once that verification process is done, which we anticipate by the end of December, that'll be all wrapped up. Then the State Board of Education should be able to do the final runs on those numbers and send those requests for distribution to the comptroller.
And I'll say this, Dr. Clark and I recently did an interview that probably ran about 15 minutes. Each of us could go in the weeds on this a long time. We'd have a day-long seminar,
Right.
but we got about 40 minutes, so we'll hopefully maybe be able to hit the highlights of some of these issues. Dr. Clark, then, as far as you're concerned, again, you're doing, one of the things, too, you got to do, maybe I'll jump off money for a moment, you also have to do what, ESSA and this, you got a lot of different things for your administrators
Right.
to have to pick up on, and you're going, I think, through quite a lot of series of seminars to educate the educators, right?
Yeah, we're in the process now of building a sequential set of workshops that will start in January, the first week of January. All of January will be focused on the evidence-based model that Dr. Jacoby was just talking about. We'll do 11 of those across the state. That's to drill deeper for superintendents and school business officials to drill deeper to understand how does this actually work, what does it mean for my district, and how am I going to be expected to spend the money. In February, we're coming back with a second workshop, which will be geared and focused around what's known as ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is a federal law that affects every state, particularly Illinois. And then in March, we're coming back with the third sequence of asking districts to come and learn how to write their district's plan as it relates to their spending components from the evidence-based model and the accountability piece from ESSA. So 3 pieces to that: learn about EBM, learn about ESSA, come back, put it in practice, and start to write your district's spending plan and accountability plan going forward. So lots of things are changing on the accountability side and the funding side for all school districts in Illinois.
Well, Jason, on the principals end, are you dealing with ESSA? What issues are you focused on?
Well, that will be one of them. Obviously, any of these issues trickle down to the principalship, either directly or indirectly. I think, you know, what's interesting about ESSA, and I appreciate the work IASA is doing, the work to get superintendents up to speed, and I'm sure we'll look to grab onto some of that and try to figure out ways of getting our members up to speed. But, you know, ESSA is still in play in terms of its development right now. We've got early childhood indicators that have to still be set, 3 through 8 indicators that still have to be set. So all the pieces aren't totally clear yet with exactly what all the parts and pieces for the ESSA plan will be. Interestingly enough, though, with the plan that Illinois submitted, the Fordham Institute gave Illinois and a couple of other states a perfect score related to the ESSA plan, just in terms of the appropriateness of the accountability, working to give school districts as much local control over that, states local control over that as could be, and just making sure that it's not looking at just one standardized test one moment in time, bringing in student growth measures and a variety of other things like that. But probably first and foremost on my members' minds, Terry, and I'm sure these guys will have some thoughts on this as well, probably more than anything is what's happening in the classroom related to the lack of teachers. You know, in the state, we currently have over 2,000 positions open. We're seeing something I never thought we would see, which is we're having schools struggling hiring elementary teachers and PE teachers of all things. And so
I heard that last year, and I was surprised to hear it. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm the guy on the street, the average Joe. I'm not dealing with this, and I was surprised. Teachers and substitute teachers.
Correct. Yeah, both of those are a problem. Anytime I'm in a meeting with a large number of principals, I always ask the question, how many of you have substitute taught or covered a class in the last week? And usually every time over half the room raises their hands because they're not finding enough subs. So we've got a variety of issues, because no matter what we do with funding and ESSA, though those are 2 critically important topics, if we don't have educators in the classroom to teach our kids, all this other stuff's really for naught.
Yeah. Roger, as the head of the Illinois School Board Association, you know, one of the things that always struck me, and I'd like people to note, I think it's one of the greatest examples of civic virtue that all these people join school boards and they're not compensated. The amount of work that they must put in for their individual schools, coming here and all the workshops that you all put on, and what we're talking about. You all have to kind of communicate these issues then to those school board members. Just give us an overview. How do you approach that? How do you educate those who run our schools?
Well, I think the key is to make sure that for those folks who are governing a school board, that they understand that governance means to hire good administrators in many cases, set policies, and then really support the implementation of best education practice through their administrators. Sometimes with newly elected board members, understanding that role. Sometimes, you get elected and you think maybe your job is to do or be things that really aren't good governance. So we work very hard from the beginning, and in Illinois there's a law that requires new school board member training on that component to make sure they understand that their role, proper role, is to be involved in the governance and work with and hire a superintendent and then allow that individual to do their job. So on items like ESSA or the funding formula or the teacher shortage, we need board members to be proactively involved in advocating for those issues, but appropriately in the boardroom passing policies and making sure that they take actions that will be supportive of the professionals that they've hired to do those jobs.
I've talked over the years with many educators. Let me something, before I ask some specific other policy questions, something I don't really know. You each have your own individual roles. That's why you have different organizations. To what extent do you work together on the issues? I mean, we all have you here, but when you're going after school funding, I would think that's one where you're probably all focused on. You've got the ESSA, as we've talked about. How many of these issues do you work on together collaboratively, and the evidence-based models, another one, the part and parcel of the new funding school, and how is it that you do that? How often do you all kind of pick up the phone or physically get together?
Well, it's as much as needed, and it's been needed a lot. And so even when we were working through the evidence-based model, even though, we had sort of a technical and political side to that we had to handle, we made sure that all of us were involved in the critical kind of directions of that, especially related to, what's in, what's out when we started to get into negotiations with legislators. And it was pretty important for us to have a collective viewpoint on that level. In terms of formal meetings, I think probably about once a month or so, a little bit less than that, where we sit down for half a day and kind of work through all the issues. But that doesn't count all the phone calls that we make.
No, and I would say, we have a formalized relationship called the School Management Alliance. That's the actual banner that we work collectively under. But I think there's almost a seamless division of labor within the Management Alliance, willingly so, saying, hey, this is your issue, I'll take this one, this is yours, and you just it's kind of like you draft a little bit. Well, you've got a lead runner out there, and then when your issue comes up, okay, you take the lead, and then they can draft, and it's really it's pretty good team effort, because you asked about the economic impact, I think, earlier on.
Right.
It's somewhere around $29 billion in Illinois that goes through the school districts. I don't know what percentage of the gross domestic product that is, but that's a big number, and our job is on that side of managing that. So there's lots of things that the IPA leads on, IASBO, we lead, School Board Association, so it's a shared pool.
What are some of the issues that, when I'd be talking to people about the funding formula, and I talked to Senator Menard about that, and so I got educated on, well, what is it you're basically trying to achieve? And for those who didn't necessarily know, I mean, one of the things that he brought up was, if you're in Chicago here, you've got all kinds, as we look out the window of this room, there's one high rise after another, and you can have property taxes on it. If you're in an agricultural area, you just don't have hardly any commercial property out there to tax, so you're somewhat at a disadvantage out there, right? Roger, you are from an agricultural area, and we're
well, look, I think that was the center of the issue we had with equity in the state, and I think more than anything, the promise and the hope of the funding formula is that we bring equity to funding. there are lots of complicated issues related to counting dollars that are used to levy against to support school districts. And if you look out the window here and you read the
TIF
stories,
districts you're talking about?
sure,
Yeah.
and you see 60 cranes in the city of Chicago, that begs a question of whether or not all the economic activity and all the funds are being collected from those, or are they in a TIF district, or are they not in a TIF district? And then there are
Do
the
you guys
agricultural
get to have any
issues.
say on a TIF district being formed?
Well, that was pretty, well, I think there's going to be discussions, and I think that we'll have people. I know that Dr. Clark and Dr. Jacoby's associations are working with a group they put together. We have an individual on our staff that's worked on that before that we're hoping will work with
what
them.
purpose? I mean, to say, talk with the local schools before TIF district is approved?
No, there's a task force appointed by the General Assembly. There's 3 members from each of the 4 caucuses. So we want to weigh in with professional and expert testimony on that, with that group, from experiences out across the state. So as I said a couple of days ago, our task force ranges from literally Barrington to Belleville and south and north of both of those, and we'll be weighing in on with that task force. Because to Roger's point about the EAV, you could take a couple blocks right here just outside of the room we're in, and there's probably more EAV in that couple blocks than there are in legitimately several school districts that are functioning today.
Or maybe several counties.
Yeah, well, I don't know about counties, but certainly school districts. So it has to be dealt with at some point.
Well, and then there was a disagreement, a pretty strong disagreement about what should count and shouldn't count.
Right.
When people used to think years ago about TIF, it was something that was associated with economic development and blighted areas. Well, I think this is a good example. We're not exactly in a blighted area in downtown Chicago, but there might be some properties that their EAV isn't necessarily going to support the levy for Chicago Public Schools. So it's a very complicated issue. This gets to your point earlier, and I think how the division of this takes place. Certainly superintendents and business officials have an expertise in this area that we count on from the school board side. And so in those types of situations, they have professionals who deal with this every day that are putting a committee together to look at it and help lead this. And from our standpoint, we want to be there and be supportive with some of our staff and get the word out to our board members and support the work that these guys are going to do to make recommendations to the task force.
Yeah. Again, going back, and this building is filled with people from around the state attending, school board members, again, volunteering their time, getting elected. One, how long does it take, would you say, to educate the board members? Everyone has a learning curve. Some people might, but you got to be a board member for, what would you say, how long, to kind of get your feet on the ground? Because these are a lot of complicated issues we've already, we could drill much deeper in each one of these. And secondly, we've had, it seems like every federal administration comes in. We had No Child Left Behind. Now we're talking about ESSA. At what point do both the teachers, the principals, you all in the management say, stop the world, guys. We need to catch up on what we're doing. You're throwing too many reforms at us. If every 3 years we got to have another major reform, at the same time we're trying to just get the basics understood by those who run our schools, is that an issue, or are we inundated with reforms and
A few years
changes?
ago, I kind of came up with the term. Yeah, well, I call it reform fatigue.
Right. Yeah, well, absolutely.
And we had, and probably to some degree still do, reform fatigue. And one of the symptoms is the statement, "Oh, here we go again," or "Here's the next best thing." And you hear it all the time because, you do get tired of having whatever the flavor of the day, and oftentimes politically
And it's both
motivated.
at the Fed and the state level.
And that filters into a district, and that's why local control, and we believe the fact that, those 7 individuals working together with an administrative team make the best decisions for their children, and the most stable districts have a path, and they don't need to change every few years by whatever comes out of either Springfield or Washington.
Jason Leahy, how hard is it for you to, they hand you the ball and say, here, get this down to the principals, and then they've got to factor it into, I guess, their teachers and work with them?
Well, schools I mean, at every level, everybody's dealing with it, and I think that's part of the value that we have in the Alliance is that fortunately each of our organizations can kind of handle the area that's best suited for them. And I'll just make this statement, and then I'll get to your question, is I think the state of Illinois is very fortunate for this group to work as closely as it does. Each of us attends meetings throughout the country, and there are other states that most of them envy the kind of relationship that we have in the Alliance to tackle these issues, because it's a litany of things. I mean, really, since the economic downturn in schools, you've dealt with new learning standards, new accountability standards, new evaluation standards, new standards for how we handle student discipline, or just to name a few. And any one of those things by itself is very significant and takes a significant amount of time to get up to speed on, implement, and then systemize. But we dealt with these things in rapid fire succession and still continue to. I can't say for sure that we're starting to get a sense of catching our breath, maybe. I think for principals, they would tell you that probably dealing with new teacher evaluation has probably burned up more time than just about anything. Where when I was a principal now over almost 12 years ago, I would really start thinking seriously, though I was in classrooms all the time, but start thinking seriously about the evaluative process when it comes to the paperwork and everything else associated with it, maybe about this time of the year, maybe even more so after Christmas. Now, day one hits and it's on your mind, and you're starting to deal with the administrative logistics of that. And it is quite a arduous process, and one that buries people in frankly a lot of work that may or may not be necessary and frankly good for kids, because it's making adults spend more time on process rather than thinking about what's good educationally for their students.
Let me have you each answer this. In each of your organizations, what's the number one issue or gripe that you get, and that you say, boy, if we could fix this, all my membership would be feeling much better? Mm-hmm. Mike, let's start with you.
Well, I would say the first gripe is we don't know what we have when we have to make decisions. What that means is that you don't know what state funding is going to look like for you, and that you have to make significant personnel decisions without that knowledge. You don't know what your real EAV is when you're filing a levy. You're doing, sort of an
for a bond issue or
anything. Like if you're doing an estimate on that. So just your general levy. You file your levy before the last Tuesday in December. You usually find out what your actual taxable value is in March. So you're doing everything ahead of when you're getting the data. You have to let go of personnel by law around the first week in April, but you don't know what you're going to get in state funding until the end of June. So it's just this continual guessing game that's going on. And then on top of that, stability. So, in the last 3 years, we've had 3 actually different funding formulas that have come forward. They didn't want to use the old one, so they put in a stop-loss grant, and they did an equity grant. And finally, now they landed on a new funding formula. Well, that just creates, havoc when you're trying to do long-range projections, have some sort of dependable idea on what's coming into the future. And if you don't have a good sense of what kind of framework and foundation you have financially, it's very difficult to meet the educational needs that are coming up and growing and coming every year.
Brent, what about you?
Certainty and stability. 2 words that capture what Mike just described. Our members are in sync with what he's talking about, because while school safety is the preeminent issue we deal with, funding and financial underpinnings to run the operation is next in line. So we're really good at, I think, pretty good at focusing on school safety, but we have no control over the stability and certainty of the financial picture coming at us. That is always the what's your word, havoc? That's that's the havoc that ensues in every school district. And it's unfortunate. It's been that way a long time. We've got a lot of suggestions on how to fix some of that in terms of just moving the dates a little bit.
That's what I was going to ask with Mike. You talk to the lawmakers?
Absolutely.
I guess it's about trying to change this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you can move a couple dates and change a lot of that where you're making those decisions once you have real data, real understanding in hand. And it makes a lot of sense to do that on the street. It seems to get into the General Assembly confusion mix, and it hasn't moved yet.
I was trying to think of an appropriate analogy, but it's like trying to close on a house when you don't know what your income is yet. Right?
Or possibly the price of the house.
That's right.
Right. And to what extent is this uncertainty, going back to what Jason brought up, as far as we talked about the schools, trying to teachers, substitute teachers, or the difficulty in hiring teachers, to what extent is this uncertainty a factor in why don't we have enough teachers? Why are people not going either into the teaching profession in Illinois, or maybe they're leaving it?
Well, there's probably a multitude of factors, and I'm sure we can all weigh in on these multitude of factors that have caused us to be at a point of teacher shortage. It's an item that just 5 years ago we were having 50 to 200 people apply for a teaching job, and today now we're saying we don't have any applicants.
Is that right?
So it's a multitude of things. We have beat up the profession over the last 5 to 10 years. We've made fun of the profession. We have changed the retirement security to the point that they now would come in and they would pay more for their pension than their pension is worth, and then they would get to work until they're 67. In order to collect that, it's pegged at Social Security wages. That's the financial side. We've made it very difficult to get into the profession to earn a license. We've made the tripwires in terms of passing tests to get into the profession much, much more difficult, particularly on the mathematics side. And there's a whole host of teaching that doesn't require the strongest math skills. I mean, it doesn't take the strongest math skills to teach a foreign language.
Right.
And we have a desperate need for those teachers. So there's lots of potholes here that have created the teacher shortage. There's not a singular solution that fixes those. It's going to take multiple solutions to address those, to make a pathway for people to come back into the profession.
Roger, for those who don't know, you're a former House member of the Illinois legislature. So when we talk about trying to communicate with the legislature, I presume you sometimes, maybe I'm wrong, have maybe the ear more of some of your former colleagues, but maybe not. But at least you understand perhaps more than the others member here, where those members are coming from. What's the big, if you had a magic wand and could fix one of the problems for your membership, what would it be?
Well, for school board members, it's pretty simple, but it's kind of a large issue, and that's let local board members who are elected locally run their schools. Everybody has a good idea, maybe something that's working in their locale, something that they feel that, boy, this is great, let's do it everywhere. Everyone needs to do what we're doing. So someone will introduce legislation because it's well intended that everyone do the great things that we're doing. It'll get a little momentum because it sounds really good, and then all of a sudden 850 plus school districts in the state have a mandate to do something that may not make any sense at all in their district, and it takes away from the local control necessary for those members to make decisions that they think are best. And sometimes it has to do with money, and it's an unfunded or underfunded mandate. Sometimes it just has to do with time and control of employees and resources, which is also taking away local control. So if there is one thing that and we've seen a proliferation of mandates in the last 8 years, and a lot of those have to do with reform groups that in many cases have never been inside a school building to run one, that have the best ideas on how this all should get done.
When we say unfunded mandates, I
Yep.
I think that goes over some people's heads. Give us some specific examples so that people can get a better handle on that.
Well, I'll give you one. When the General Assembly required the doubling of time for individuals to be behind the wheel in driver's ed and took away driver ed simulators that were being used in suburban school districts. Suburban school districts had to hire additional personnel, even in rural areas where kids are driving tractors or farm trucks for years before they're 16. There used to be a way that those kids could demonstrate proficiency and only have 3 hours behind the wheel. Well, in one fell swoop, one bill, that doubled. So you had to have 2 times as much labor to perform the same, and you didn't do anything. And they promised
and of course
funding.
They don't give you any money to
Well,
do this.
the promise was there that there was going to be funding, but it's never come through to the extent of the cost. Underfunding is as bad as unfunded mandates. So it's difficult. Now, in the last couple of years, we've worked with the General Assembly. I'll give you an example of one, the lead water testing mandate. Nobody wants to sit on the other side of the table and say, we don't think it's a good idea to test water. We're going to oppose this, but help us pay for it. Let's figure out a way that together we can do what's right for kids in this situation. Nobody wants kids drinking water with lead, but let's figure out a way to pay for it, and we did. We worked with the General Assembly. So it was still a mandate, and an important safety mandate, and some of them are very important, but it wasn't unfunded, and it wasn't underfunded. So that's an example of how we can work on those issues. But there's just a great desire by folks who get elected to come up with something and fix a problem that really doesn't exist. Sometimes we have solutions searching for problems, and the politics then gets involved in it too, which really makes it messy.
Well, I often say, once some politicians have a press conference, then they kind of wash their hands of it. They figure they got their day in the sun, and that was good for their political career and showing that they're doing something, but was, as you just said, maybe sometimes these solutions are in search of a problem.
Absolutely.
A problem, I think, is still out there, and one of funding. And this is, too, where the people might say, hey, we've passed this bill now, we got a budget, you guys are paid for, we're all good. One of the problems, Mike, let me say, there's per pupil funding, I guess, and I might be stating this wrong because I'm no expert in school funding, but then you had this thing called categoricals, which is a different level of funding than just the teaching in the classroom, and that might involve things like the money compensation for transportation for school buses. So the money is starting to flow from the passage of the budget, but where are we on in some cases, a school district would be owed millions of dollars in past due categoricals. Where are we in getting the categorical money coming through?
So in the absence of having a school funding formula in place in August, the comptroller made up some time on that. So the third quarter, fourth quarter payments from the prior year were starting to flow. We're still waiting for the final fourth quarter of last year to be distributed to schools this year, and we hope it'll happen before the end of December. But nothing related to categorical payments for this year has been distributed yet. So,
is that from July 1 when we
yep.
say this year? Okay.
Yeah. So we're still behind. I think part of the borrowing that the state did to deal with sort of the Medicare and Medicaid kind of payments.
And by that you mean the bonds. We just did about $6 billion or so in bonds.
See, none of that comes to the schools. That was all to other providers, and most of those providers were due a % per month interest on the dollars that they hadn't received from the state. So that was really the priority there. So these other dollars that schools need are still not out, and they're still not coming forward.
Do you guys get interest for monies that you've been waiting for?
No,
No.
the Prompt Payment Act doesn't affect
No.
public schools or municipalities.
Yep. Schools,
12% a year
yeah,
is the return on that for those vendors.
that's right. So we're still behind. I think a lot of the hope of a new budget with different revenue sources that eventually will provide resources to hopefully get close to balance will begin to right that ship. Whether or not we get caught up in this year or it takes us a couple of years, I'm not sure. But again, we still got $350 million that's not flowing even on the evidence-based model. So that needs to come too.
There's a backlog of bills and a lot of competition, and I would just say that we all have advocated with the comptroller's office, and I know IASA has strongly advocated with Comptroller Mendoza, and it's made a difference. And we appreciate it. We do appreciate it. There's a long line of people knocking at that door, and it's good to have folks in these associations that have relationships and are known. And I know, again, I know that the people I talk to over there hear regularly from the IASA and IASBO folks as well, and all of our alliance. We push them and we say, hey, what about us? Of course, there's a bunch of people behind us in line too that are saying, what about us? And if it's Medicare, Medicaid related, if it's health related, she's got tough decisions to make, but I think she's really tried hard to listen to us. So I appreciate that effort.
I mean, just recently, the backlog of bills went from about $16 billion, we're about $9.5 billion, I think, on unpaid bills. So there's the thing I would say, that's $6 billion that's going to be going back into the Illinois economy. Then all that backlog of bills money should have been circulating, it wasn't. which obviously has some ramifications.
You know, just in the medical field in Springfield, which has a hub of state employees, there were a lot of medical providers, though, that were pretty much leveraged to their hilt in terms of all they could borrow with all of their assets. And I'm sure a lot of this money that went to those went to pay off that borrowing that they had done, which simply means that the bank made the money on it.
Right.
And
I talked to one dentist, and he said the state owes me $600,000. One dentist in Springfield.
Yes.
And you wonder how they could keep their doors open.
That's right. Well, they borrowed money.
Well, the key to this is this isn't a solution to a problem when you borrow money to pay bills. I mean, but the economic sense, the fiscal sense that it makes is you're paying less in percentage on this borrowed money than borrowing it from the dentist and the doctor and the accumulated borrowing.
We were required to pay about 9 to 12%.
So you're saving that money. It's kind of an arbitrage situation.
It is, yeah.
But it's important to really face the fact that doesn't solve the problem. That's still borrowed money, and we probably still have a structural gap somewhere to fund everything we need to fund. And
we do. One of the structural gaps that's glaring in our budget right now, our state budget, is the way to deal with the pension payments that are coming due.
Right.
And until we're willing as a state, as a General Assembly, as a governor, to get that amortization fixed so that we can afford the payments, even if it extends the payment period, until we're willing to do that, we're going to either always face a structural deficit or have to always look at additional revenues. It makes a lot of sense, at least to this fella, to fix the amortization schedule where we can manage the payment and know we can pay it.
Let me squeeze in one. We're coming down to in a time, but I just came out of a speech here, and there's, for those who've never attended a school board conference, there's basically multiple events going on simultaneously, probably true of any number of conferences. But I just heard a very interesting speaker, and he was talking about school safety. And of course, every parent, we unfortunately hear these events happening. On school safety, and let me have you chirp in on this as a principal, you probably focus on this any number of times. But one of the things he was saying is it doesn't necessarily take a whole lot more money, but you ought to, this expert was saying you need to be able to lock the doors on the inside too. So if there's an event going on in your school, the shooter can't come into your classroom. To what extent, and I tend to think, you know, it used to be the focus would have been a lot of what we're talking about, funding, how much do you need, you know, are we getting our schools? Now we got to think of things that should never be an issue. But to what extent is, let's start with you, Jason, to what extent has this whole ramification of violence in the schools and shootings that we see nationwide impacted all of you as educational leaders?
Well, I think it's always, I've got 5 kids in school now. And so I think it's something that's always sitting in the back of your mind. When I was building principal in charge of a school of 1,000 kids and 300 prior to that, it's something that you're constantly dealing with. And I think trying to leverage every asset that you have in order to make schools safer, you should. Fortunately, I think you can, you know, work with your risk management plans and health, life, safety dollars and things to work with the physical space that you need to, which is a good thing. But, you know, beyond that, I think it's making sure you've got good relationships within your community, with your local law enforcement, so that you know that you're in step with them, and that's not always the case.
Do you have the people, principals, invite law enforcement to come through to make sure they have a floor plan of the school?
Absolutely. Well, and we work with various vendors, you know, that Navigate Prepared, I'll just put it on the table, is somebody that we've done that do a really nice job of providing 360 imaging of classrooms and then putting that stuff out there in a web-based system so that not only the school personnel have access to it, but then you also give law enforcement access to that as well. I will say this, though, Terry, since you brought that up, and you know, we deal with safety issues. Obviously, Chicago is dealing with quite a run of different things that are both school-related and non-school related, but you know, even the rural parts of the state are not immune to this. Mattoon, a few weeks back, dealt with a tough situation. A teacher really stepped in, saved the day, and their staff has done a superb job of dealing with the after effects of that as well. But I will say this, you know, you start hearing the calls for, well, we need to arm every teacher in the school. I think those kinds of things are not the right solutions. I believe that every school needs a student resource officer, needs those high quality relationships with law enforcement, but more than anything else, we just need to make sure that educators have a great relationship with their students. And when you've got those kinds of things happening in schools, typically then if there is a problem, if there's a child that possibly could hurt other students or hurt themselves, when administrators and teachers are working well with their kids, typically another kid will inform principals and teachers of what's happening.
That came out in that before any shooting, it always turns out someone knew something,
Sure.
or they certainly knew this kid was troubled or had some kind of a real issue.
And if a kid feels safe, like they can go tell an adult, that usually is the thing that will save the day.
Mike and Brent, let me kind of have you, to roll back, we talked about unfunded mandates or even just mandates. And so you all might, let's just say for the sake of discussion, say on school safety, hey, we agree we could have locks on the school doors or whatever you come up with. That's going to take some more money. To what extent, but it kind of goes back to maybe the lawmakers need to think, hey, if you put a mandate on, you're making me spend money in this pocket when I don't really need it, and then I don't have the money to put the money where it's absolutely needed, where there's a fire going on, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's only a finite pile of resources, and so if you spend it on one thing, you can't spend it on another thing. And it's interesting, even in our conversations about the evidence-based model and what dollars can be counted and so forth, you can't count a pension obligation as dollars that could go into a classroom. So it's really important for people to understand that those finite dollars are being distributed among the needs of any system. And so if it's safety needs, if it's pension obligations, if it's other kinds of resource allocations that are needed to meet a mandate that's not part of your core mission, then those are going to take away from your core mission.
Let me, before Brent, that raises an interesting question. Is there any average, if I take a budget, a school budget, and they're going to vary all over the board as far as what their top line is, and I guess that would impact my question, but to what extent people go, well, Huck, we're spending so much in education. What % of the money that we send to a school goes into the classroom versus, your heating bill, your air conditioning bills, you say maybe paying for the school bus. I mean, these are enterprises, and there's a lot of money to keep those being run. So a lot of that money doesn't make its way to the classroom.
Can I interject, and I don't mean to step
Sure,
on
go
Mike
ahead.
here, but all of those dollars go to the classroom because everything that goes into that school impacts ultimately what's happening in that school. That's my editorial comment. Okay. It may not have been what you were looking for, but don't think that HVAC doesn't impact.
Heating, air conditioning.
Yes, doesn't impact what's going on in the classroom. It does.
Or school bus.
Well, for sure. I mean, keeping up your facilities matters. These guys.
But on the other hand, you might, I don't know if you are mandated to have a nurse at every school?
Mandated to have a school nurse within the system, and then you can have, registered nurses that are less qualified in each school.
I might just say on a supposed basis that if I said to the four of you, if I untied your hands on mandates, you might all start spending money a little bit more directly where you think it's needed and not necessarily.
Well, it comes back to what Roger said. It's up to the local school board working with the community and administration and the teachers to make those decisions.
For what works for them locally.
There's a little bit of a misnomer on that too, that just because you relieve a mandate that you're going to immediately eliminate that, because many mandates are in place because they are the right things to do. So, take it on the the safety side. Well, we're not going to pull out, the AED machines from every, sporting facility just because we're not mandated to have them there.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have them there because that's a safety measure for anybody that comes into your building. So when a mandate goes in, it usually comes in under the idea that this is a good thing to do, but taking it out is very difficult. Even PE, we got a relief on PE in this last session, so now it's only mandated for 3 days a week. But every student is in that building 5 days a week, so you still have to pay for the other 2 days, even if you reduce the PE time. So there's not necessarily a direct savings from every mandate relief, but better local control gives you the options.
Well, it gives you flexibility, and look, I can tell you that the price of AEDs are a lot higher than they were before they were mandated. No matter what it is,
That's
carbon
right.
monoxide detectors are more now because now they're mandated. So when I was a superintendent, and Brent, and I know Mike deals with this with building, and Jason had as a principal, insurance companies come around and do an inventory walkthrough of your building, and they count the number of chains and how high your swing sets are from the ground. And they leave you a list of things that they want you to fix in order to continue to have insurance coverage. There are all kinds of risk management things we do on a daily basis that aren't mandated by Springfield. They're not mandated by anyone, but if you're going to get a decent insurance rate or even coverage, you're going to do this list of things that are safe for kids. It doesn't take a mandate to do that. It just takes good management, common sense, and you know, making sure you're doing what is best. And you do those things pre-mandate, and the products that are necessary in order to carry out those safety items are much less. Once they're mandated, price always goes up.
Well, gentlemen, I know we could talk a lot longer, but I want to let you go because you got other things to do, and we so appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. I think we covered a lot of issues in a relatively short amount of time, and just as you all just answered, a lot of times we don't hear beyond the headline, and when this is being covered just in the news media, so it's good to have this opportunity to hear a little bit more. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Terry.
Hi, I'm Dave Treader, President of the Federation of Independent Illinois Colleges and Universities. For years, Illinois was known around the world for the quality of its colleges and universities, and not just our public universities, but the many private schools that do such a great job educating more students annually than the publics. Schools like Bradley University in Peoria, Millikan University in Decatur, Loyola University in Chicago, and Northwestern University in Evanston. These are just a few examples of the schools that not only educate the next generation, but also serve as economic engines for their communities, with tens of millions of dollars in payroll and the purchasing of millions of dollars in local services. In fact, the combined economic impact of Illinois' private colleges and universities is over $20 billion annually. Collectively, these schools account for $3.5 billion in state tax revenues annually. Illinois' independent colleges and universities are a key pillar of the economy, bring in billions of dollars to the Illinois economy, as well as adding a cultural richness to our communities. That's why it's important that the state programs like the Monetary Award Program, which enables low-income Illinois residents to attend college in our great state, remain funded. And it's also why it's important for all of us to understand the economic impact of our colleges and universities have on the Illinois economy and our communities. This is why I'm also happy to serve on the Illinois Channel Advisory Council on Higher Education. Their statewide, in-depth coverage of the issues that impact our economy, our government, and our cultural resources help to inform us all on the issues that matter. I'm Dave Treader, President of the Federation of Independent Illinois Colleges and Universities, and proud to be a member of the Illinois Channel Advisory Council.
Next, from Chicago, we talk to Jonathan Edison, a success strategist and author of Survival Mode, the true story of a young man's triumphant journey through loss, poor grades, failures, setbacks, depression, and homelessness. Mr. Edison discusses his memoir, how he overcame a rough childhood to make it to Harvard University, and how he passes on his life lessons to students throughout the country. This runs about 15 minutes.
Jonathan Edison, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. And you have a book here, Survival Mode. What is the story about, and who does it pertain to?
Oh man, Survival Mode pertains to this idea that no matter who you are, there are things that happen to you in your life. And for me, I graduated high school with 1.6, did my first year of college with a 0.82.
You took my GPA?
Yes, sir, GPA. When I look back on my life, it wasn't because I was dumb or stupid. It was because I was in survival mode. My mother was on drugs and alcohol. My father left, and I was being raised by my grandmother. She died when I was 14 from breast cancer, and I was forced to live in my aunt's basement and pay her $50 a month in rent and work at Chili's Grill and Bar. So when I went to school, it wasn't about education. It wasn't about learning. It was about surviving. So this idea or concept of survival mode is, it is the idea that life is crashing down around you, and it's hard to see yourself in the future because your moment is flooded with a lot of things you weren't expecting.
How did you break out? And I presume you wrote the book because there's probably some good life lessons that you learned the hard way that you can now share with others, so maybe they don't have to suffer what you suffered.
Absolutely. I call it going from survival mode to beast mode. And that is finding small successes, getting addicted to that so that you can move forward. So for me, it started off taking remedial classes at community college. It moved from remedial classes to regular classes in community college. Started my career in Detroit Public Schools as a bus attendant. Went from bus attendant to educational technician. Then I ended up getting a bachelor's degree of science K-8 all subjects to becoming a classroom teacher, getting a master's degree, becoming the youngest assistant principal in the history of Detroit Public Schools when I was 27, and currently I'm a student at Harvard University studying the psychology of human performance. But all that came out of this idea that small successes lead you to something big. So that beast mode is mastering that small success and getting to the next one.
Did you say at Harvard, are you working on a PhD? Or?
Actually, it's a double master's degree. I currently have one. I was going to do my my PhD at the college that I went to in Detroit, Wayne State University. They told me I was 0.55 from getting into the college. And I said, wait, I have 3 college degrees from here. And they said, we can't let you in. And a buddy of mine said, hey, man, they got this program at Harvard. It's for students like you who want to up their professional game. I went for the intake, and we got engaged, and then we ended up getting married. So,
on the other hand, let's take that example. That was another setback, and you obviously were probably scratching your head and going, what are you talking about, right? But by the same token, maybe one of the obvious lessons is when you hit an obstacle in your life, don't let that obstacle stop you. Have a plan B. There's ways to still advance. You just got to get around that particular obstacle.
You know what I call it, Terry? I call it reframing your thinking. It's cognitive behavior therapy. So whenever something happens, I've trained my brain to reframe instantly. So for example, Wayne State says, you can't come. We don't want you, even though we know you. Okay, we're going to Harvard now? Thank you, Wayne State. I appreciate that. You lose your keys in the morning. Most people lose their minds about that. I can't find my keys. Not me, Terry. I go, you know what? The universe, God Almighty, doesn't want me to kill myself, and he needed to hide my keys, or she did, for a few minutes before I go out into this traffic. So I'm always looking for ways to reframe. I'm always looking for ways to take something bad and turn it into something positive.
All right, so when you were a principal in the Detroit schools, I bet you saw a number of young people, boys and girls, that you recognized because you had been in their shoes that were probably in survival mode. How did, as an educator then, you having had those life experiences, how did that make you approach those children that you knew were struggling and in the survival mode?
I taught near a place called the Brewster Projects, which was the feeder school directly into the middle school when I started out teaching. And every kid in that project had either my story or a version of my story. So I made it my business, Terry, to show them another side of the world. I would show them my homework. Matter of fact, I had one math class that we walked all the way through, and what I mean by that, when I started my master's courses, I said, hey, this is what I'm doing, and this is how I'm doing it. This is how I advance in life. And when I graduated, I took 30 middle school kids with me on a bus to my graduation at Cobo Hall so they could see somebody graduate, to put that idea in their mind that what's possible for them is possible for all.
So much of us, and I think, if you had great parents, you won the birth lottery, but sure. We get life lessons, good lessons, bad lessons. It depends upon what your role models are or the people that were the authority figures in your life, and some authority figures are bad people, right? So even as a child, at what point did you realize I can overcome this? Instead, it seems like a lot of people say, I can, and woe is me. I mean, how did you break out of that mode?
Terry, it was from a guy, he was my 5th grade teacher, Mr. Clyde M. Lewis, and we still are connected. He taught my kids how to fish. He lives maybe 30 minutes from me. And I remember when I was in the 5th grade, Mr. Lewis would consistently say, "Jonathan, you have something special." Now, I was getting the Goodfellas box, which is the box that has the irregular shoes, the irregular pants, socks, and food in the box. But he would say, "Jonathan, you have something special." And he would say it over and over and over and over and over again. And finally one day I said, "Mr. Lewis, what is it that I have that's so special?" "You have great oratorical ability, son." I said, "Mr. Lewis, I've never been to the dentist before." He said, "No, boy, you're talking, your memory is something amazing, and it's going to take you around the world. Now sit down and be quiet." I said, No. You mean me talking?" He says, "Yes, you talking is something amazing." I said, "Well, you need to talk to my other teachers, because they told me to shut up and sit down and be quiet." But just him pounding that into me, Terry, got me to this place where I started to believe it. And imagine, 20 years later, he was right. I do have something special. And I go around the world sharing that gift that he helped cultivate when I was in the 5th grade.
I was going to say, as we are here at the Hyatt in Chicago for the Illinois School Board's conference, you were one of the speakers in the
general session.
The general session.
Closing
so
it
you
down.
have like 2,000 people crowded in there.
Yes, sir.
And you were one of the speakers to that. So there you go. It's not just talk. I mean, it's you were doing it today. And how many speeches? First of all, on your book, how many books have you written?
I've written 9 books. As a matter of fact, I've written a children's book series that focuses on word usage and improving and increasing who a kid is, their self-esteem. I've written a book on leadership. I've written curriculum that goes with survival mode.
It sounds like all your books are kind of tied into that, helping the child that you were.
Absolutely.
If people hear this, I mean, people will hear and see this, if they say, boy, I'd like to get those books. How? And folks, we're not doing a commercial here, but the point is, if just, you know, it's an old saying that life is an attitude, but in your case, so much of it you're saying is true for everyone. Not just your case, it's true for everyone. It's just that you're really implementing your dramatic story about other people had so much more in life than...
I hate to go off camera. This is the Big Adventures of
John, the big game.
The big game.
Was this the first book?
This was the first installment of the children's book series. And throughout this book, there comes to a juncture where John has to make a decision about something that's happened very tragically. And that's what my grandmother taught me, how to make good decisions when bad things go wrong. So here it is, a story that allows kids to read. We have an app that comes with the book that teachers can use. There's curriculum that comes with it for pre-K through 2nd grade. And it's amazing what it does for a child and their thinking process when it comes to making tough decisions.
You're a fascinating guy. We could talk for at length, but I'll try to wrap this up here. But is there a point where a child is lost, where it's too late? Obviously, I would say if you start earlier, the better, probably. But what are your thoughts that some people would say, well, if only we had caught him at the age of 5, but now he's 15, he's too long gone. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, when I was in the 3rd grade, Terry, my 3rd grade teacher wanted to double promote me. But my mother was in a drunken and high stupor, and she told her no. She said, I don't think he will be able to do what he does socially or perform. So they didn't do it. In my coursework last year at Harvard, my Harvard professor came in and said, "Jonathan, we want to talk to you. Before we do any tutoring with you, I want to ask you a question. Why are you here? Why are you here? By all intents and purposes, you are successful." I said, "Ma'am, doctor, I am here to explore my genius. That's why I'm here." I said, "It should have happened many years ago, but I'm here now." So I've discovered that it's never too late to become what you might have been and what you should have been. So if you got a 3rd grader that's not doing what he should be, catch up with them in the 8th grade. If you got one that's in the 9th grade, you don't know, catch up with them in the 11th grade. You don't know. No one has the right to say what a kid can't do, because Colonel Sanders didn't graduate from high school.
Well, and we might all say, and I would bet, that almost everyone is probably operating far below their potential.
Yes,
They're getting by in life. Maybe they're only operating on 20% of what they could be.
I agree.
And I think this is where we see the Tony Robbins books and all the things that awaken the giant within. And I suppose you're a great example. You're a living example of that no matter, like I said, some of us won the birth lottery, some of us didn't. But if you are in control of your life, right? And you're a good example of how you turned it around amazingly, despite starting life with so many obstacles.
Yeah, you know, that is the testament of you can turn it around. You can make a difference on the planet. Who knew? I was speaking to a group of kids who were in a rough part of Alabama, and I said, you know what? This isn't the end for you. This is the beginning of finding out who you are, and then realizing how far you can go. And I'm talking like rough of the rough in Birmingham, Alabama. But I told them anything is possible.
Could you tell, did that fall on barren soil? Did any of it take seed?
Every one of those babies in that room, and they're high school students, I'm calling them babies, were at full attention. Tears streaming down their face because I was talking to the big them inside that hasn't been out here yet. And it's screaming to get out. And I think that's for everybody. That big you that lives within you is screaming to get out. But all that's on display is the small version of you.
Well said, and as I said, you're a great speaker. We appreciate your time, Jonathan Edison. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Montgomery, President of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. More than 100,000 IFT members work each day in schools, universities, colleges, and state agencies across Illinois. They're professionals who teach our students, keep our public buildings safe and clean, and provide critical state services, and much more. As an advocate for our members, their professions, and those we serve, the IFT works in Springfield to support legislative policies that promote high-quality schools and public services. We also fight to protect collective bargaining rights for all our members and all working men and women. We do this through an organized program of advocacy and year-round monitoring of public policy proposals. And that's why the IFT is proud to support the work of the Illinois Channel, whose coverage connects us to legislative debates and committee hearings, as well as interviews with leaders on key issues like the state budget, tax policy, public pensions, and education funding. Funding education is one of the primary responsibilities of Illinois state government, so we should all pay attention to the policies being proposed and how they may help or harm our children's futures. You know, what's happening in the State House today directly impacts what happens in classrooms tomorrow. And what happens in classrooms impacts the future of our state and our nation for decades to come. I'm Dan Montgomery, President of the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and I'm proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Education Advisory Board. The Illinois Channel, it keeps us all connected.